Welcome to this new series of the Massey Dialogues. My name is Nathalie DeRosier and I'm the principal of Massey College. Massey College is located on indigenous land, the land of the Seneca, the Huron-Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. We are grateful for their stewardship of the land and for the ability that we have to continue our work here. The Massey Dialogues are based on the idea of bringing together the voices of experts and the voices of the young researchers. This intergenerational aspect is key to the vision. We want to discuss issues of the day and hear different perspectives. I want to thank the Massey community for the wealth of good suggestions that we have received throughout the summer, and particularly to Keshna Sood and Michael Valpy and their committee for putting together this fall program. Enjoy today's discussion.
Okay, good.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Massey Dialogues. My name is Julia Kim. I am a cellist and a doctoral student at the University of Toronto Faculty of Music, and I just became an alumna of Massey College this year. And I am so delighted to be your host for this afternoon's discussion of the impact of COVID-19 pandemic and racism on the arts sector. To talk about both the impact of pandemic and racism on the arts in an hour is a daunting and an impossible task to achieve, but I'm hoping that this discussion will become the beginning of more lively and in-depth conversation about the state of the arts and culture. Before I go on to introduce the panelists for the discussion today, I want to point out that this discussion is an interactive discussion and invite anyone to ask questions you might have by typing your questions on the right side of the screen to the live stream webpage on YouTube, and we will try to answer them. I am honored to be joined by three wonderful guests who come from different disciplines of the arts. Because of their many, many achievements and the short time frame we have, I'm going to do a pinpoint version of the introduction. You can see their full bios on Massey College website under the Massey Dialogues. First up, we have Ali Momen. He's an award-winning actor on stage and on the screen. We also have Olivia Shortt, who is a multi-disciplinary performance artist. And last but not least, we have Gaëtane Verna, the director of the Power Plant's Contemporary Art Gallery. So the discussion will go by starting with impact of COVID-19 pandemic, and we'll go on to talk about systemic racism on the arts sector. Okay, so my first question is for Olivia. Olivia, can you tell us how the pandemic impacted and changed your practice as a performance artist and a musician?
Yeah, so I, like many musicians, had a lot of my year already planned out. I had a lot of travel ahead of me. This year was actually, and I don't want to sound, negative and like sad about things. Of course, I had a moment to sort of grieve the loss, but then also found the positives and silver linings, I guess, with a global pandemic as much as you can. So I was supposed to be in New York a few times this year. I'm working with a string quartet there and a school program called Face the Music. Mm-hmm. And we had numerous things kind of planned for the early spring. I don't even know the number anymore, but I had a lot of concerts canceled originally. And I was also curating a number of concerts for the music gallery and just some of my own projects. And there were a lot of things. They just either got canceled, postponed, or indefinitely kind of paused. Right. But the thing is, as much as there was that moment of like, oh no, everything's canceled, what do I do? I found that this has been a really interesting time because I've actually ended up being just as busy as I was originally supposed to be, but with new projects and with kind of very different directions. I'm doing a lot of work online right now, and it's kind of been a really great time for me, as much as I can say that during a global pandemic.
Right. I sort of know how you feel because, me also being a cellist, everything being canceled, we can't talk about the loss of job and everything. But I also understand the changes, the new changes that brought by a pandemic has positively impacted our practice. Being online is possibly more accessible for some people, but also possibly not for some others. And Ali, I'm just curious, as an actor, how the pandemic has changed your art form.
It's changed it greatly. I was I was doing Come From Away. We were going into our third year at the Royal Alex, and now we're at the place where that essentially can't be done. Not just because of the difficulty of making the art, but the difficulty in terms of its presentation. Moreover, live theater is something that doesn't truly fully lend itself to online, or at least not yet. Perhaps later we're going to get there, but that's not where we are right now. So it's has it changed how I make art? Sure, absolutely. But I think there's a larger conversation to have in that can the kind of legacy theater things be done online, and can they be effective? And I actually don't think we've answered that yet. I don't know if the answer is yes, to be quite honest.
Right.
Because it's just not as simple as I think a lot of people think it is. I think it's like, oh, just take your work online. And I think that's easier said than done. It's easier said than done. Yeah.
Right. And Gaëtane, as a director at a gallery, can you tell us what are some strategies that you have come up with to cope with the changes?
So, first of all, thank you so much for coming up with this topic and presenting it within this context, and for inviting me to join together with the others. So I would say that as a gallery, so for me, of course, people always think that you can view artworks online, which I think there is room for that. But for me, I think that social media and online is really, it's a vector in order to get you in front of the artwork, because your reaction to an artwork is completely different when you look at it online and when you actually are physically in front of a painting or a video or a sculpture or any form of art. There is something about our physical reaction to artworks. And so, of course, as a gallery, one of the things we used to do before the pandemic, because a lot of the people who follow the power plant also follow it from abroad. So we had what we call virtual tours of the exhibition, where you can go every season and look at our exhibitions, online. It will never replace being in the space of the gallery, but it is something that we had done before and that we just continued to do. One of the things as a gallery is that we do public programs. So of course, we had a symposium for around March 21st, and in February, none of us wanted to do it online. We didn't know how to do it. We didn't think it would work. And then now we're like super, where everybody's Zooming, and we've done our symposium on Zoom. It had its benefits because it did widen the scope of the people who were able to sign on. We had people from Malawi, people from Bangladesh, people from Thailand, Canada, all over the world. And that was, in terms of a talk, I think that was very beneficial and very easy to pivot. But I would say that in terms of visual art, it is possible through the virtual tours, but it will never replace the visit of the exhibition on site and having the physical reaction to the work and being able to, step back, step forward, and look at the work for what it is in all of its materiality. And then lastly, I would say that together with other colleagues in Canada, we set up, I mean, I can't even believe how everybody worked really, really hard. I think the art sector is one of the sector where I find people are so dedicated and just put stuff together, you know, in minimal time with minimal budget in order to continue to serve the public. And so together with other museums, we developed a site called fieldtrip.art, where basically everyone who's doing educational program for their different museum, all of that is on one platform and is distributed, you know, to each of our constituency, but also together. So that was something that was completely new, and that was suggested by my colleagues at Contemporary Calgary. And now I think there's about 45 or 60 institutions across Canada. So once a month, everybody gets to put in one program. It could be a talk, could be a talk with artists. There's been residencies. So these are some of the things that we did, you know, besides closing the gallery.
Wow, that's really amazing. So potentially anyone in the world can experience art galleries and museums in Canada. And that's really great. And that actually ties nicely into my next question. Now, the fall 2021 season is upon us. And no one knows what's going to happen in the future. How, as artists and arts institutions are coping with this uncertainty? How about you, Ali, in the theater community? How are we coping with this uncertainty?
So I'm just going, oh yeah. So how are we coping in the theater community? You know, most theaters have had to cancel their seasons, and there's just been a long rush of that. Because I think, as you know, we've spoken about, the legacy way of doing the work has now kind of left, and the shows that they had laid down to do can no longer be done, because the financial model of a theater is it's very difficult. You know, in Ontario, we have a 50 indoor person gathering limit. That is impossible to make money. It is near impossible. It's beyond impossible. And that isn't just the show like Come From Away, which from my estimates, I think costs $600,000 a week to make, just to put on. Wow. But even if you take an independent theater, even if it's a one-person show, a two-person show in a small house, I mean, the cost of that, it's not pennies. People have, I think, this notion and this idea that art is made in our bedrooms. I mean, we're doing this Skype call, some of us in our bedrooms, but art requires a lot of time. It requires a lot of collaboration. It requires a lot of technique and just a lot of technical aspects. And so that's kind of what's happened. The first step is they've just like put it away. And now in the theater community, we're seeing people trying to figure out new ways to put on shows. I know Can Stage is really trying to do some dance shows that they're going to do outside. Outdoors is something that they're really trying to do. But my gut tells me that, you know, we were the first to go, and they say we were the last to come back. And what's really fascinating about us artists is that we're supposed to be like the most risky, the most kind of open-minded and dangerous people. Yet this pandemic has shown that we actually are the most considerate, safe, kind, and decent group of people. We've never once came out there and screamed, hey, I don't understand. If you look at an airline, they're filling up the seats in an airline. You walk in a bar and you see like 50 people unmasked getting drink. No, but for some reason in the arts community, we said, no, we're going to shut down. We're going to be safe. And that speaks to the empathy of us as people. It speaks to the goodness in us as people. But my guess is that I think we are now going to say, hold on, is there a way that we can actually do this that is in a way that is safe and that allows us to still present art? And I think we're going to start to see organizations and artists start to question some of the policies and proposals that are laid forth by the government. I speak about that 50-person kind of gathering limit indoors. 50 people inside a bar is not equivalent to 50 people inside the Royal Alex that holds 1,200 people. 50 people inside an airplane, sorry, even more, it's sold out, is not equivalent to a theater in which we can mandate masks. We can say no food, no beverage whatsoever. We literally put the seats out in a way that can distance. So we are in a highly controlled, I can go to the brass rail right now, but I can't go see a play in a controlled way. And I think you're going to start to hopefully see people not go out there and do super spreader events. That is irresponsible and ridiculous. But I do think we are going to get to the place, we are creative people, and we're going to start to say, okay, how can we creatively get ourselves out of this and do this actually in a way that is possible, as opposed to just, you know, sit back and wait for the miracle vaccine day, because that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen.
Yeah. So that speaks volumes to what artists and arts institutions are experiencing right now. And Ali, do you think that is the job of arts institution, or more so the government and the policies and the politicians?
The arts institutions are beholden to the policies set forth by the government. So therefore, it is actually up to government to do certain things to allow and to facilitate the presentation of specifically theater. But this also applies to live musicians who want to make music. This applies to art galleries that have capacity limits. This applies to even film sets, who a lot of film sets can't even go on and shoot right now because they can't get insurance for COVID-19. Right? Because if they have to shut the set down, I don't know if you're like Robert Pattinson on Batman, you know, he had to shut down for 2 weeks, right?
I heard about
so
that.
Insurance is a big issue right now. So really, it's like government should be there in the same way that, you know, they had the SIBA loan, in which $40,000 with a $10,000 forgiveness if it's paid back in 2 years. The wage subsidy, which really doesn't help artists. I'm very grateful for the wage subsidy that's going to the arts institutions, but that actually doesn't trickle down. Because, for instance, Mervish or any organization can get that wage subsidy, but who's that wage subsidy going towards? It's going to basically the administrative staff. It's not going to any artist. It's not going to any technician. It's not going to any of us. So a lot of these policies that they have created are really not helpful for the arts industry. I'm grateful for so many things that they have done, but there are still creative solutions that they can take that I don't think that they're doing. For instance, they can subsidize houses. They can say, look, you're not going to make money on 50. However, we don't want you to go above 50, but you know what? We are going to subsidize the house. And this is something that, you know, Julia, you spoke to me about, that you came to me through this. This is actually what happened in 1935 during the Great Depression in the Works Progress Administration by Roosevelt, right? This happened. So the government, there are many things that they can do, because we are beholden. We will do it. We are creative people. So if you allow us to do something, we will do it. And if you help us, we will do it. And we need more help, and we need more permission.
Right. So that is part of the Arts New Deal petition you have going on right now, Ali. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so, you know, once when this began, I quickly realized that we were in a very, very, very dire situation. And I realized that, you know, this is something that's going to last for a very long time. But being kind of like a history buff and kind of a political buff, and especially American history, I remembered, you know, in 1935, during the Great Depression, there was a period of very low employment. And the Roosevelt administration embarked on something called the Works Progress Administration, which first began with direct relief, so grants and money and to unemployed people. But then it went towards work relief. And what they did is they quintessentially gave people jobs, you know, to build bridges, build roads. They gave people work. But one of the things that Roosevelt did was he viewed a shovel and a violin or a cello equally. And he viewed the artist as a worker. And he viewed the contribution that an artist can make to the infrastructure of society is equal than that of somebody who can lay some bricks. So what they did was the government actually hired artists to make art, to just overproduce levels of art that really never happened before in America. It began the careers of Mark Rothko, Langston Hughes, Arthur Miller. It also created the careers of Black writers like Dorothy West, who really at that time had no voices. Like part of the mandate of the of the Worksburgers administration back then was to elevate kind of marginalized voices and to bring an equality of distribution of art across the country. The point being that this program was a leapfrog event for that country. It made America, that used to be very much an imitation of Europe, it gave them a cultural voice. And so I sit back here and I go, we have thousands upon thousands of artists that are out of work. Just imagine what they could do if they actually contributed art. I'm grateful for CERB. I'm grateful for the Canada Recovery Act. But imagine if the money that I would receive from the government was tied to a creation of art, whether singularly or collaboratively. Imagine what could be done for this country. So that's what you could go to makeartswork.ca and you could sign a petition and you can get in touch with Stéphane Guibault, our heritage minister, to make that happen.
Thank you so much for that, Ali. Olivia, do you have anything to add? As a musician, like if you imagine the works of, the music being played as part of the New Deal and stuff, do you have anything to add?
Well, so I come from a very different perspective than obviously both Ali and Gaëtane. I am an independent artist, multidisciplinary. I come from a music background, but a lot of my work, I tend to make myself flexible into whatever I want to do at the time, which can be both good and bad. So what I have found in trying to just honestly seek ways to support my own work is I've ended up getting into the world of podcasting, and because I'm coming from sound design as well, that it was the most natural transition, and people are looking for help on podcasts. Like everyone's starting a podcast right now. So I'm definitely coming from a very different place. So I realize how privileged I am, but I'm seeing it even in my own friend groups and amongst my colleagues, the work that they're making right now. A lot of us are on these smaller levels, very small budgets, or being financed a little bit from different, mostly theater organizations. I do a lot of work with smaller theater groups, but I've created a bunch of new works recently that came from funding from small organizations who were just looking to find ways to keep making art, to keep artists, to give them jobs and give them space to be creative if they have the capacity for that. There's been a lot of organizations right now, like Why Not Theater in Toronto. I've been supported recently by them through a fellowship I'm doing. Up in the Air Theater, which is based out in Vancouver. Just some of these organizations who are, much smaller than, say, a Mervish, but have been very creative and I definitely would say to people to look at what those organizations are doing and seeing, just seek them out. And I would say even talking to them. So all of that to say is that what I'm seeing amongst at least my community and the musicians that I know is that a lot of people are kind of switching up how they make art, because a lot of them are kind of independent contractors like me.
Right.
They're either making their own work as composers or they're performing or improvisers. And it's just been kind of this has been a weird time for a lot of independent artists to sort of switch it up and figure out if there's other ways of disseminating the art that they may have made in person, like in bars or in concert halls, and finding ways to be creative, whether it's I saw that there's been a few theaters in Toronto who've been doing projects like having outdoor performances, but having scattered around the city, so that it's kind of a thing you can come upon it by accident, but also you can plan to go see it. There's still a sense of being able to distance yourself from other people because it's outside. Right. But yeah, I've been seeing a lot of people get really creative, but it's definitely on a smaller level with independent contract type artists.
But I definitely think what you're doing is very similar to what I am doing as also an independent artist. And what Ali is doing with his petition going on, and what the government can do to support the arts, can help the smaller and more independent artists in a bigger way. And potentially this new movement to create arts in more spaces and disperse it in different ways can create more opportunities for a more diverse group of artists. And now I want to shift the focus a little bit to the systemic racism in the arts today. Many people working in the arts and culture industries and who are consumers of the arts industry would prefer not to talk about how the systemic racism has impacted the arts. But the artists, especially the racialized artists, feel the impact so deeply. And Gaëtane, I want to start with you. I want to know how systemic racism has influenced the distribution of the arts in galleries and in museums in general.
I would say that, I come from originally from Montreal, and when I moved to Toronto, I would say in 2012, so 8 years ago, I can tell you that there's been a huge shift in terms of museums. So we're talking non-collecting museums or collecting non-for-profit galleries. I'm not talking about the commercial art world, but I would say that even before the pandemic, and before Black Lives Matter, there has been a shift, like an increase interest, but still not to the point where we could see any equity or in. And I would say that it's when we think of visual arts, it's as much as who is exhibiting in the institution, and then who is working in the institution. So, for most Black folks, when you walk into a museum, you will see people of color working as either coat check or security guards, but not, in any higher up or decision-making position. If we look at the AGO, there's only one curator of color, which is, a Black curator. And for I don't know, I think it's a team of 300, or I don't know how many staff members or how many curators at the AGO. So all this to say that those question of systemic racism and inequity towards, Black people and Indigenous people is a reality. It's not just a make-believe. It is something. Right. I must say that, interestingly enough, when you look at Ontario and Toronto specifically, I must notice that, the co-lead of TIFF is a Black man, Cameron Bailey. I'm the director of the Power Plant, which is an important, institution, and I'm Black. And the director also of Soul Pepper is a Black woman. So, this is while being critical of this, I must say that there are changes that are happening, and that we see those changes in the visual art. Which has always been a much more conservative in terms of a bastion. I would say that a lot of work has been done by artist-run centers, and for a long time, because there have been artist-run centers who have always given themselves the mandate to be presenting the work of artists of color, like A-Space in Toronto. There's also organization like BAND, which is celebrating, I think, 10 years or more, Black Artists National Dialogue, and then other organization. So, but it's interesting for me to see the shift where, suddenly, with more institutions are realizing that they need to address these questions. They need to diversify their team. They need to diversify their boards. And it's in a sense, it is kind of sad that it took George Floyd and what Black Lives Matter have been saying, since they started. And if you look at, the civil rights movement or the Indian liberation movement, none of this is new. But I think it really took the pandemic and George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and all of this and people being at home to kind of make everything, explode into itself. And I think it is something where it is the responsibility of people that are in leadership position and white people in leadership to do the work and to want the change. Because what a lot of people have told me is when they're the only person of color in an institution and suddenly the institution asks them to vet, the message. This is not when you're hired for a job, I'm the director of the power plant. So this is my responsibility because I'm Gaëtane Verna, the director of the power plant. But it's not the responsibility of my donor programs officer, who is a Black woman, to do this. This is mine because I'm the director. And that's where also I feel that the onus is, it needs to go from the top to the bottom and from the bottom to the top. And as a director of an institution, one of the things that we did, this was way before the pandemic, was really, I made it mandatory for all of my staff to do a training with the Indigenous Friendships Center in Toronto. Because I thought if the power plant is an institution who has values about diversity and equity, then we as employees need to understand the history of the relationship of Canada to Indigenous people. And if you work for the power plant, you need to understand this, because in terms of some of the exhibitions that we will choose to do, some of the content, this is also weaved into the culture of the organization. So I insist that you take this training, and I took it, we all took it. And now we've also selected a series of books that will be a reading list that I haven't figured out in terms of HR and what you're allowed to impose to people or not. I don't know that part. But for me, if I was ruling the world, this would that everybody has to read those books so that you understand the role that you play as an individual who is working at the power plant. If you go work in another institution for whom this is not important, that is your business. But if you work at the power plant, this becomes part of your responsibility. And the last thing I would want to say is that it is, at the power plant, I'm very proud that we have a really culturally diverse team. And I always tell people, I don't hire everyone, I hire my managers and then they hire their team. So it becomes part of our value system to have a diverse team. And the other thing that, to me, having a diverse team makes you more dynamic and also enables you not to get into the pitfalls of not knowing, and I'm not saying that each of my staff represents the world, but there are, between ourselves and our different experiences and our different networks, if I have a question about something that has to do with, another community, Western Asian community, around the table, I had somebody that I could say, okay, is this valid? Interestingly enough, sometimes there were comments by visitors or by other people where I was insulted for, of other people in the community. In another community that wasn't Black, Western, I remember there was a case where somebody had written something at work, and it made a comment regarding, people of Arab descent. And I was really proud that many of my staff members who are not were appalled by it, you know?
Right.
And then we thought, okay, are we overreacting? And we were able to be in touch with one of our colleagues and say, okay, are we overreacting, or does this seem like this is not acceptable? So to me, this is the beauty of having a strong, diverse team, because your perspective of the world goes beyond your own perspective. And especially when you're working in a non-for-profit public institution, you have a responsibility to a wider community, and and most of the time to things you in your personal life might not have had the opportunity to be confronted with it. But that is not a reason for you not to know where to seek the information and find solutions to that. So I would say in closing that I've seen changes, not enough and not fast enough for all these artists who are there, who want to share with the public. And then I would like to say that in my 8 years of showing artists from all over the world, the problem is not the audience. I've never had an audience member tell me, oh, you're showing too many Black artists or too many Indigenous artists or too many artists from, Western Asia or whatever. It is the people who hold the power that are the ones that are stopping. And there's a handle on Instagram called Change the Museum, which is, I would tell everyone to go read it, because I'm flabbergasted by what I'm reading. And this is an American handle where people of color, BIPOC people, are telling true stories of, comments, attitudes. And I'm just floored by the level of, inequity and racism that people of color have to deal with, and then being asked to, not get upset, not get mad, and take it as if. And so to me, it is the responsibility of the leadership of institution, and then it becomes a responsibility of every individual who decides to work in a public institution as an individual. And then the other layer that I hope through the art that we show is that citizens also, as individual, take a responsibility to understand their neighbors, understand other people, and to also understand that people of color, we constantly have to figure out how to understand white people. So why when the others don't seem to be attuned to do it, nobody taught us this except our parents taught us, and we've had to figure out how to do it. So we're all humans, right? We're all equal. We're all the same in essence. So it's an effort that everyone can achieve. Believe you me, it's not that hard, because we have all had to do it. So I don't know if it answers the whole question, but that's my perspective.
Thank you so much, Kenton, for that. I mean, you mentioned some of the most important stuff. I'm like, yay, we're all going, yay. And Olivia, I know you also come from classical music background, and the problems of systemic racism is pretty apparent in the classical music world as well. And as an individual artist, do you see any changes happening in that?
That's a great question. I am seeing very small changes. And I have to say, Gaëtane, everything you just said, I was like, oh, my heart, like you said everything that like I've just been in my head for so long. So I appreciate what you just offered to us and to the audience. Classical music is this world where there's so much about that I love, but then I am frustrated by the people who are gatekeepers in that world, because honestly, to get into classical music, there is this financial barrier for a lot of people. And if you can't afford lessons, if you can't afford instruments, if you're a singer, there's always the expectations of big gowns, and there's, like it gets costly. And that's just the start of costs. And university, no one tells you when you go to university for classical music that you're not just paying for your tuition, you're paying for all the equipment you need, for all the repairs you're going to need if you have an instrument. It's just thing upon thing. You need an accompanist. That's a huge cost. Like, it's not included in your tuition.
No.
So,
Nope.
you know, that's why when you look at a lot of the students who are going to some of these big schools where you have to pay tuition and it's not tuition free, a lot of them are coming from a lot of wealth, either from their own family. And, you know, it is really frustrating. It's very difficult. And in some ways, yes, I have seen some positive changes. I do see organizations who are being pressured by granting bodies to think about what composers they're asking to come into their spaces to work with them. You know, I am seeing some of the organizations in Toronto specifically, you know, hire an Indigenous composer once in a while, a Black composer once in a while. I still don't think it's good enough. And I have ranted all over the internet at people, directly to them, and also just on my own social media feeds. But it is frustrating. And that's also why I think I ended up becoming a multidisciplinary artist, because, you know, I'm in a unique position of my father's Anishinaabe, my mother's family is Irish. So I tend to be read as white, and I can walk into a lot of spaces in a different way than my friends who have more melanin can. And I hear a lot of things that are really messed up come out of people's mouths. And a big thing that needs to change is who's in charge of these organizations.
Right.
It's still a lot of cis straight men, white men specifically. And there's a lot of good white men, but also, like Gaëtane was saying, whoever's in charge, whoever has the power, what their values are definitely trickle down to their staff and to the people that work around them, to the environments they're creating. Yeah, that's why I've ended up doing a lot of theater work, is because I have found so many beautiful people who have these like incredible minds, but then also like their value systems reflect so much more onto mine. So I would rather be around a bunch of badass, you know, Indigenous artists, Black artists, artists of color, than be in spaces where, even though I'm read as white, I still don't feel comfortable in those spaces. I don't really want to make music in a lot of those spaces anymore, because it's just like a weird white boys club, and it is frustrating. So like, yeah, sorry, that turned into a bit of a rant, but it is really frustrating, you know?
Yeah, Olivia, you have every right to rant, and I can resonate with you there. As a first-generation immigrant to Canada, I can tell you so many instances. I love playing in orchestras, and I love the music, but I can recall instances where I feel like I am the elephant in the room that no one wants to talk about. But nowadays, I'm seeing more people who look like me on the stage, but in the administration, it's still, you know, far and few in between. And Ali, can you tell us a little bit about the acting world, how racialized actors can only play certain roles, and what are they doing to change that?
First, the thing I want to say to, first of all, the thing that you mentioned, Olivia, Ravi Jain, who is the artistic director of Why Not Theater, is a very good friend of mine, and he spoke about a podcast. I actually do a podcast. It's called Soft Revolution. It's an artist advocacy podcast. And a few weeks ago, we had Ravi on talking about, you know, racism in the theater. So I want you all to check that out. It's really great. I, of course, would love to, and I have this joke that I tell people, that when you go into any kind of theater project or any film project that you're in, you know, I don't know how it is with you guys, but you walk into, I call it the BIPOC room, like a room where we can have our own private little conversation, and we can get together and we could say things like, oh, you know, like, even though Indigenous, Black, Asian, Persian, there's things that we get, because we've all have, while not the same lived experiences, we've had similar moments where we could speak to each other. And I totally understand, Olivia, the sentiment of wanting to go and just, you know what, I want to get into the room and just be with Why Not Theater and Ravi, or I just want to go and hang out with, just be in the BIPOC room all day. But we have to recognize that what I am fighting for is I'm fighting for the middle class life, for artists, for the ability to live a middle class life, to have the dignity of a middle class life. And that, unfortunately, particularly in the theater, resides in those white, cis, male places. So as much as it's great for us to go and do our own thing and go into our own, and we must do that, but we must also go into those legacy organizations that have had such a head start. See, look, my dog, he's getting compassionate. He does it. He's this is Rumi. He's blurred out, but let me unblur him so you can see what's up. Actually, I don't know how to unblur him, but he comes in whenever I talk about this or when I talk about Trump, he just shows up. he just shows up. But that's what it's about. That's why it's very important for us to actually not be like, bye, see you later, we're going to go form our own thing. I think it's important to be like, no, because this is only going to continue the kind of privilege if Stratford stays the way it is, if even Mirvish stays the way it is, if all these organizations stay the way they are. It's important that these organizations that have had years upon years, like, look at the size of those theaters, look at the size of those institutions, look at the size of those salaries. That is a product of privilege. So it's important for us to go and to not just form our own circles, but to fix existing circles. And it's happening. What's really funny is, and you mentioned it, Gaëtane, is that all those things that we knew in our core were true. And sometimes when we spoke up, we were told, oh, you're on a high horse, or oh, you're playing victim, or oh, you're seeing something that's not there. We were right. So what this experience has really taught me, and if there's anyone of color or a woman or anybody who is marginalized, that feeling you have, even though society will tell you you're being, and I'm going to use the word uppity, you're not. You were right. And to listen to that part of yourself that felt that injustice, and to keep going with that voice. And I really love now to see so many people go, oh my God, Ali, I had no idea. It's like, well, I had an idea the whole time. I knew. So listen to me, and going forward, listen to us. It's not coming from nowhere. It's not coming from nowhere. So.
Okay. So apparently we have a question coming in. I can't see that question. Has there been any effort to see or understand if any substantial changes to programming or organizational structure and staffing at the arts institutions who have published statements supporting BLM? Well, that's a great question.
I can address that. I could address that in the theater world. I can't address it in terms of programming yet because, there's a halt in programming, understandably so. But I can see it in some of the leadership. Certain people have, stepped down to make space. I mean, who knows if they were going to step down, or who knows if they're using it as an excuse or whatever they were doing. But there has been instances of individuals stepping down in order to quote unquote make space. So it has been happening in the leadership and that I'm seeing in theater. So
that's so good to hear. Anyone else want to add to that?
Well, I could say something about this. I can say that I think a lot of people are, recently, I've seen a lot of prizes for arts going to people of color. So, and I don't want to minimize it to say that it's only happening because of Black Lives Matter, because it happened before, but I can see more of it lately. And then people being interested in, because we, touring shows or looking at who is programming what, in the recent months. And then when in jobs, certain jobs, I can see I can see how some people are really, trying to step it up. The one thing is, of course, all of this is really new because this all started in March. And in terms of really making change in hiring policies and also in program, what will be important is for us to follow through, so that it's not just like, oh, there was Black Lives Matter, we were all stuck at home, and this, it's the onus is on everyone to keep doing that work and to evolve it on a longer term, so that and I always feel that even, let's say, even if you had no one of, for instance, the board my board of directors, we've had people of color on the board. And it's interesting because some of the board members were like, oh my God, I wouldn't even put myself on the board now. And I said to them, whoa, stop, because what I also want people to understand, if you look at the composition of the board of the power plant now, you could say, oh, it's mostly white with one Indigenous person. But this is the board that is supportive of my program, of the program of the power plant, right? So you don't need a board that's all people of color in order to have diverse program, because as Ali was saying, it's like everybody needs to be part of those conversations, regardless of your color. You should be interested in those subject matter. And so I think the good thing is that we have enough social media and activists. You have enough people who are actually telling institution, you did put that statement, we will be watching you and seeing how you will do it. Because of course nobody has, our expectation have to be sidelined for just now, because we're in a pandemic and we're not fully functioning. But I really love the fact that activists and people on social media are really taking institution at task and understanding that they need, if you wrote that message, we will be waiting to see how you implement that. And that everybody has a responsibility. You stand by the words that you put out, and that people of color will not listen to you just say, oh, we did this because it was the pandemic. People, right. I think that that's important for everyone to understand their own responsibility. As we are citizens, we pay taxes, we're part of this community, and we won't wait anymore to ask for recognition and I think one thing that's important to think of is that in a perfect world, you have some institution that could be Indigenous led, for Indigenous, by Indigenous, other institutions like the power plant that is not, the power plant's mandate is contemporary Canadian and international art. That's it. And that can be led by a person of color who's doing diverse programming. So both should be living together. That is what equity, and I think that's what people of color are asking for, is equity. And that, so.
All right, so we have a follow question for that. Has there been any that was the same question. I am of the impression that theaters, galleries, and etc. that have published statements in response to BLM have seen a withdrawal in donations.
Okay, I'm going to say something about that. I'm going to say something about that. That's a very interesting thing. First of all, we're in a global pandemic and a recession. So let's assume there is a decrease in contributions. Why can't that be the explanation? Number two, this is something that I see and I have seen often, in that, for instance, if this group of people wanted to get together and put on a show, and heaven forbid the show wasn't a profound success, the refrain that you would hear is like, see, we tried. We put them, we gave them an opportunity, and it failed, right? Whereas, like, how many times have we gone and seen a show full of white people that sucks, and no one, that fails financially, But then no one afterwards says, you know what, we shouldn't be doing that. We shouldn't be doing that. And that's what that kind of correlation causation reminds me of. That it's because of X that Y is happening, as
Right.
opposed to thinking that there must be a myriad of different explanations
Right.
for this thing. I want to say quickly, like we did, speaking of Mirvish, we did Disgraced at the Panasonic Theater. It's a Pulitzer Prize winning play by Ayat Akhtar, a Pakistani American. It's a very highly, it's like with 2 brown people, a black woman. But obviously, you know, I joked with Raul. I was like, Raul, if this show isn't successful, like, we ain't coming back on this stage.
Mhm.
Thankfully, it was one of the most successful plays that they ever did. But like, yeah, I think the core of that is you know, we just do not have enough data to say that because of that, there's like this kind of like reaction, like a racial reaction. So, you know.
Thank you. Yeah, that,
Yeah.
yeah. I'm sorry, I have to get it out there. And lastly, I want to ask one more question to Olivia. I think we are probably, I mean, I'm still in school, but I think you also graduated not too long ago. And what is your opinion on what the higher education institutions can do to combat their racism in their art programs? Yeah.
Wow, I'm gonna solve racism in 2 minutes.
Sorry about that.
No, I love that question, and it's something I definitely thought about while I was in school. I did my undergrad a while ago. I left school feeling kind of disheartened, and then did other things, and then eventually went back to school for more grad work. And to a degree, like, school gives you certain things, but I think institutions are, at least from a public standpoint, it feels like they're just acknowledging now the issues that are happening.
Mhm.
The University of Toronto, the alumni of the Faculty of Music wrote a letter in which, people wrote different situations that had happened to them, and it was a huge letter. And the faculty responded and, said, thank you for this. We do need this feedback. And I think they need to be more public about expressing things, like in general, supporting not just the Western canon, which is also such a funny thing because we study classical music, but then why is the Western canon the center of it? And that always other types of classical music are treated as like world music ensembles all the time. You're always like, oh, I'm just gonna like go learn about this other art form, when you're like, that's also classical music. They just have a different language system for what they do. So it is frustrating, and they're just publicly now starting to do some things like, and this isn't just the University of Toronto. I'll quickly throw in just a U.S. example, but the Manhattan School of Music had a huge thing with their head of opera, who, made an offhand comment during a Zoom. I think it was during a class, and people wanted MSM to be accountable. And I think that's a big thing that people, like everyone in this conversation, is talking about, is accountability. And like, we want equity, but also we want to hold the institutions that are hiring us, that we are working for, that we're a part of, to be accountable for their actions and for their words, so that, it is more of a community perspective and a way of looking at how do we support people versus just making great art, but also supporting the humans who are behind it. And I think institutions in general, universities, art galleries, whatever, need to have that mindset more. I'm generalizing a little bit, but yeah, that's what I'm seeing.
Right. It is almost time for us to go. To end the conversation.
We're not going anywhere. We're in our homes.
Right. This was my attempt to talk about the racism and the impact of pandemic on the arts in under an hour. I hope this was an opening to more discussions in the future. See, Massey has never talked about the arts in the Massey Dialogue. So, and it took me, the one colored artist to bring this together.
Bravo.
Good for
Yeah.
you.
So thank you so much for being here with me today, and thank you, Massey College, for hosting us.
You did a
Thank
great
you.
job, Julia.